This church leader tool is going to be different than many others. It's a lesson that I've had the opportunity to teach to groups and to congregations numerous times, and I usually call it Outreach Jumpstart. But for the purpose of these church leader tools, I'm going to break it into 5 parts. Those parts will be the mission of the church in today's society. Then we'll talk about strategy. Then we'll move on to the welcome system. And finally, we'll talk about outreach. And I think you'll find that those first 4 steps really are building blocks so that when we get to the actual outreach part, you'll understand how it all fits together. So let's go ahead and start with the first of these 5 pieces, and that's the mission of the church. What is our mission? What are we about? We got to start with that in order to have the right foundation. And the best way I know to get to that foundation is to talk a little bit about Scripture. It will jump out at you if you're paying attention that at the end of each one of the Gospels, we find a strong mission from Jesus to go and spread the message that Jesus had for us. So we could look at the first Gospel in the 16th chapter of Mark, and we would hear Jesus saying to his followers, go into all the world, and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. We clearly find this foundation of Jesus sending us out. Or we could look to the beginning of the book of Acts. You probably know that Luke and Acts were written as a 2-part message. So it's at the beginning of the Acts, we find this message, and Jesus says, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem. So we're in the city there, in all of Judea, spreading out to the next level, and to Samaria, out to the next largest geographic area, and to the ends of the earth. So we find a strong outreach message there. We could also look in the book of John. John always phrasing things in a different way, but these things are written, John says, so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name, a much more personal message. Or I know sometimes to get this foundation, some folks are much more practical in the life of their individual congregation. So another way we could look at this is simply to ask, do you want your congregation to grow or to decline and ultimately die? Because that's a fundamental choice that congregations have to wrestle with. Let me break that down a little bit because you really have a choice. Is your congregation going to grow or decline and move on into death? See, here's the reality. People move. We live in a very mobile society, and some people will move away from your church. I had a season some years ago in the congregation that I served at the time where we lost about 20 members in an 18-month period to at least 5 or 6 different states. They had job changes. They had family they were going to live closer to them. Some of them were retiring. A lot of them left with tears in their eyes, but they moved away. So we live in a society where people will move away from the church. We also live in a society where sometimes people will transfer to another church. And that's painful and that's difficult, but that is sometimes the very best move for them and really for the life of the church. And of course, we know that even if people aren't moving or transferring, people die. And there's nothing you can do about your church shrinking from people dying. I have to tell you a story, by the way, that people have to be real about this. I had a man tell me one time that he had left his previous church because of a conversation in that church where they were talking about the fact that the church was shrinking. And one person noted that a lot of that shrinking was happening because people were dying. And of course, he said, those people aren't coming back. And somebody in the group said, yeah, but I really want them back. And that was where that man said, we got to go. If they can't be real about the fact that people are dying and going to heaven, and the church is declining because of that, then it was time for him to leave that congregation. And then, of course, we know as effective a ministry as we try and have, sometimes people will just drift away and become less active. So we have to address that. So in order to address that, we need to have first-time guests. We need to have new people coming to the life of the church. And in fact, folks that study the dynamics that take place in a church will tell us that in order for a church just to remain static, just to fight the moving, transfer, death, and inactivity, you need to have about 3 guests per 100 people at worship visit every week. Because, of course, we know all of those folks won't stick. 3 guests per week per 100 people, just to stay even, to fight the moving, transfer, death, and inactivity. And then beyond that, if you want to have some good growth in your congregation, you got to have 5 guests per 100 people per week. And if you want to have rapid growth, that's got to be 7 guests. So this is a reminder that unless we are having these first-time guests, we are going to decline and move on into death. Now, if you were paying attention before when I was talking about scripture, because I want to go back to that, because what I've just been sharing has just been the technical stuff. But for me, it really becomes most clear in the final words of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus gathered together with his disciples before he ascends back into heaven to be with God, says it so clearly, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." These are the words that we need to hold on to. And remember that our outreach starts not because Jesus suggested this, but because Jesus commanded this. This we often call the Great Commission, that Jesus says you need to go out into the nations and to help people be disciples. This is our foundation. And next week, we'll talk about how the mission of the church takes place in our society.